respected President of the session, Professor O.P. Banerjee, respected Professor Gopal Chandra Khan, Professor Tobin Chakraborty, distinguished teachers present here, as well as my dear students. I'm really grateful to the organizers of this seminar for inviting me to speak on the categorical imperative, a famous concept, a famous Kantian concept. The concept of the categorical imperative is the pivotal principle of Kant's theory of morality. The moral law is a categorical imperative. It is the supreme principle of morality according to him. Kant further holds that there is only one categorical imperative. However, he has given 5 different formulations of the categorical imperative and has finally reduced them to 3. The object of my paper is to give a critical account of the concept of the categorical imperative. This paper consists of 3 sections. The first section deals with an analysis of the concept of categorical imperative and an exposition of the first 2 formulations of this principle, namely the formula of the universal law, FUL, if we can say so, and the formula of humanity as an end in itself, FAT, and Kant's illustration of the application of the categorical imperative. In the first section, I should consider this. In this context, the 2 types of contradiction test for a maxim are also considered, along with the different interpretations of the contradiction test. In the second section, some objections to Kant's ethical theory are answered. In the third and the concluding part of my paper, the significance of the 2 formulae discussed in this paper is brought up. Kant's entire system of morality is based upon a rejection of Hume's view that morality is based on sentiment rather than reason. According to Kant, reason had some other function than that of being, as Hume had said, it was the slave of the passions. According to Kant, reason can set goals, and reason is particularly required in order to set moral goals, which are independent of our desires. Morality is grounded upon reason. Moral law, as I have already mentioned, according to Kant, is a categorical imperative. An imperative is a linguistic formulation of a command or order. Imperatives are broadly classified into hypothetical and categorical imperatives. Hypothetical imperatives are those which recommend an action as a means to an end. As for example, if you want to do well in the examination, read hard. It is hypothetical because we express such an imperative in the if-then sentence form. Categorical imperative, on the other hand, is an imperative which commands an action, an imperative not as a means to an end, but as an end in itself. As for example, you should tell the truth. You ought to tell the truth. Here, the imperative does not recommend an action as a means for the realization of some purpose. It commands an action unconditionally. Here, one is to do duty for the sake of duty. Let us now turn to Kant's formulations of the categorical imperative. As I have already mentioned, Kant has given 5 formulations. I shall not consider all these formulations because it is not possible for me to discuss all these different types within the span of 30 to 40 minutes. Well, I shall consider only 2 formulations, the formula of universal law and the formula of humanity as an end in itself. And regarding which of these is fundamental, there are differences among the interpreters of Kant, and whether the formula of autonomy, which I have not mentioned at all, this is the fundamental principle, or the formula of the kingdom of ends. This is a question about which the Kantian scholars debate. I shall not enter into this controversy. I shall confine myself only to 2 formulae, the formula of universal law and the formula of humanity as an end in itself. The first formulation of universal law. Kant formulates this principle in a variety of ways. There are 20 formulations of this principle. I shall not read all this. To mention only 2 formulations. Act only on that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. This is known as the FUL formula, and a variant of it is act as if the maxim of your action were to become, through your will, a universal law of nature. This is Kant's formulation of the formula of universal law. And now let me state the formula of humanity as an end in itself. And having stated these 2 formulas, I will explain these 2 formulas with the help of the illustrations that Kant has given. The formula of the universal law. Treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of others, always not simply as a means, but always as an end. Here, the import of the expression, not merely, this is important. Do not treat humanity merely as a means to your end, but as an end in itself. I shall explain this principle. So let me go back to the first formulation and explain. Immediately after introducing the universal law formula, Kant considered 4 examples designed to show how to derive duties from the universal law formula. The first thing to be noted in the formula is the expression maxim. Act only on that maxim. Now what is a maxim? A maxim is a subjective principle of action. It is a principle on which a subject decides upon a course of action. This is a subjective principle. Now Kant says that we are to act on such a subjective principle which could be universalized. This is Kant's, whether the maxim that you were operating with could be universalized or not. This is the criterion whether something can be considered as moral or not. In each of these examples, Kant presents the reader with proposed actions whose maxims cannot be consistently willed as universal law of nature. Although these examples have received extensive discussion in the literature on Kant's ethics, it is helpful to begin by examining what Kant really says in the text. I shall consider these examples are given in the groundwork of the Physics of Morals. In the Critique of Practical Reason also there are some examples. I shall not consider those examples. The first example concerns a man who has experienced a series of misfortunes and is contemplating suicide because he believes that continuing to live would be intolerable. Still he wonders whether it would be contrary to duty to have to take his own life. Kant identifies his maxim as, I make it my principle out of self-love to shorten my life if its continuance promises more evil than it promises advantage. So this is the maxim upon which I shall work. Now whether this is acceptable can be considered by seeing whether we can take its universal counterpart, that is whether we could generalize the maxim and whether it could be rationally or consistently willed. Now what would be the generalized form of the maxim? The generalized form of the maxim would be whenever continuing to live well bring anyone more pain than pleasure, he will commit suicide out of self-love. So the maxim that out of self-love, when there is intolerable pain, I shall commit suicide in order to get rid of pain. So let everyone in such a situation do the same. What will happen? Can it be consistently willed? Now Kant believes that the categorical imperative to do this cannot be consistently willed, cannot be willed as a law of nature. He tries to show it in this way. Let us give the general outline of Kant's argument in brief. The generalized maxim cannot be a law of nature. Why? If the generalized maxim cannot be a law of nature, then the agent of the action cannot consistently will that the generalized maxim be a law of nature. This is the second premise. The third premise, an action is morally right if and only if the agent of the action can consistently will that the generalized maxim be a law of nature. Fourth, therefore, the action is not morally right. Now let me analyze this argument. These are the four steps of the argument. The second premise is fairly plausible. For although an irrational person would probably will almost everything, it surely would be difficult for a rational person to will that something be a law of nature if that thing could not be a law of nature. The first premise is the most troublesome. The first premise, the generalized maxim cannot be a law of nature. This was the first premise. Why? Kant apparently assumes, this is Kant's argument, that self-love has its functions, the stimulation of, the furtherance of life. Given this, he seems to reason that self-love cannot also contribute sometimes to the destruction of life. Perhaps Kant assumes that the same feeling cannot have two opposite functions. However, if the generalized maxim were a law of nature, self-love would have to contribute towards self-destruction in some cases. Hence, Kant concludes that the generalized maxim of the action cannot be a law of nature. Here we have, in the Kantian literature, there are two types of contradictions that we are talking about. The Kantian scholars distinguish between two types of contradiction: contradiction in conception and contradiction in willing, volitional contradiction. In this case, what happens is contradiction in conception. I cannot think of the state of affairs because what is the principle of self-love? Out of self-love, I want to preserve my life. And what does this generalized maxim lead to? The generalized maxim leads me to the conclusion that I have to destroy my life. So the principle is at the same time, the principle was you have to see whether the maxim of your action would be universalized at the same time. So you are stating the maxim and generalizing it at the same time. Now if we state both these two at the same time, the result is a contradiction, because we are trying to preserve our life and again at the same time we are trying to destruct our life. This is a self-contradiction. This is a case of contradiction in conception. Contradiction in conception, and Pétain, one of the interpreters of Kant, calls this logical contradiction. He offers this as a case of logical contradiction. We cannot think of a state of affairs in which a person out of self-love wants to preserve his life and at the same time wants it to be destroyed. This state of affairs is self-contradictory. Now let me turn to the second example. Here also Kant will show that there is contradiction in conception. The state of affairs that will be spoken about is self-contradictory. And there is, I shall consider the view of another great Kantian scholar, Portsgard, who however offers a different interpretation of this contradiction test. I shall consider her views later. Now the second example that Kant gives regarding his explanation of the second formula. Kant's second example involves someone who can get himself out of a difficult situation by borrowing money and promising to pay it back, realizing that that is the only way he will get the money, even though he knows that he will never do so. Doing so would be morally permissible only if the maxim could be consistently willed as universal law of nature. So this act is permissible. I shall take loan from somebody, giving him false premise, knowing fully well that I will not pay it back. So this is my maxim of action. This is my subjective principle of action. So let us see whether this maxim could be generalized. What would result from the generalization of this maxim? So what was the maxim? When I need money and can get some by borrowing it on a false promise, then I shall borrow the money and promise to repay, even though I know I won't be able to repay. So let us generalize it. Whenever anyone needs money and can get some by borrowing it on a false promise, he will borrow the money and promise to repay, even though he knows that he won't be able to repay. So this is the generalized form of the maxim, the universal counterpart of the maxim. Now Kant's view is that I cannot consistently will this generalized maxim be a law of nature. Explanation. What exactly is Kant saying here? He is not arguing against lying on the ground that if I lie, others will soon lose confidence in me and eventually won't believe my promises. Nor is he arguing against lying on the ground that my will that will contribute to a general practice of lying, which will in turn lead to a breakdown of trust and the destruction of the practice of promising. These considerations are basically utilitarian. Kant's point is more subtle. He is saying that there is something overtly self-contradictory about the state of affairs in which, as a law of nature, everyone makes a false promise when in need of a loan. Perhaps Kant's point is this: such a state of affairs is self-contradictory because, on the one hand, in such a state of affairs, everyone in need would borrow money on a false promise, and yet, on the other hand, in that state of affairs, no one could borrow money on a false promise. For if promises were always violated, who would be silly enough to loan any money? False premise. I want to get money by giving false premise. So I want that money, I can get the money on false premise. Now let it be universalized. What will happen if everyone starts taking money, giving false promise? Then there will be no such thing as promising. The false promising makes sense only if there is promising. If there is no chance of any promise, if we can conceive a world where there is no such thing as promising, how can you get money by giving false promising? False promising, the notion of false promise makes sense only on the supposition that there is such thing as promises. So this state of affairs is self-contradictory. Since the state of affairs in which everyone in need borrows money on a false promise is overtly self-contradictory, it is irrational to will it to occur. No one can consistently will that this state of affairs should occur. Now, here also, as you can easily understand, there is contradiction in conception. There is contradiction in thinking that I can take money giving false promise and universalizing this max. So this is Kant's, second example. The standard pattern interpretation, I have said Categorical offers a different interpretation of this type of contradiction. The standard pattern interpretation attributed to Paton holds that Kant means that we cannot will the universality of lying promises, since this would be self-contradictory, logical contradiction. We cannot will lying promises to be universal because we cannot even conceive of a world in which everyone makes lying promises successfully. Universal lying would undermine trusting communication. Another interpretation of this example is given by Categorical. All testing using the universal formula rests on testing for a practical contradiction, not a logical one. Categorical thinks that this is not a case of logical contradiction, this is a case of practical contradiction. Lying is wrong, not because a logical contradiction is generated by trying to universalize the maxim. Rather, when an agent tests a maxim and gets a contradiction in conception, the purpose that is undermined by universalization of this maxim is the purpose that appears in the maxim itself. What was the purpose? I want to get loan by making false promise. This purpose of getting loan will be frustrated by this. The idea is that a maxim fails the test of universality. It thwarts the agent's if universalizing it thwarts the agent's purposes. When those are expressed in the maxim itself, we have contradiction in conception. Thus, in the lying promise case, the maxim would be something like, I will make a false promise to get a loan I want. And when this is universalized, however, people won't be able to get loans because no one would loan them any money if they could not rely on the promises. That is, the frustration of the agent's purposes. And herein lies the practical contradiction. There is no logical contradiction. There is practical contradiction. The purpose which is stated in the maxim, what was the purpose? To get loan. This purpose will be frustrated. This is Categorical's interpretation of this example. Now let us turn to the third example, another example given by Kant. The third example. 15 minutes. All right. In the third example, we are asked to imagine someone who possesses a number of potentially useful talents but cares not to develop them, preferring to devote his life to idleness, amusement, procreation, in a word, to enjoyment. Kant identifies the maxim as neglecting his natural gifts and says that even though we could imagine a world in which no one developed any of his talents, we could not consistently will that this maxim became a universal law of nature, or that it be implanted in us, to quote, in us as such a law by a natural instinct, since a rational being necessarily wills that his talents be developed. Here we are not talking about logical contradiction. I can think of a world where no one develops his talents. There is no contradiction in this thought. But the point is, no one can rationally will that such a state occurs. This is Kant's point. Let me explain this argument. The action in question, let me explain it. The action in question is the neglect of natural talents. Kant holds that it is wrong for a person to let all of his natural talents to go to waste. Of course, if a person has several natural talents, he is not required to develop all of them. Kant considers this to be an imperfect duty because a person has the freedom to select which talents he will develop and which he will allow to rust. Let me analyze this argument. Nature implanted our talents in us for all sorts of purposes. Hence, we necessarily will to develop them. If we also will to let them rust, we are willing both to develop them as we must and to refrain from developing them. Anyone who wills both of these things obviously wills inconsistently. Hence, the agent cannot consistently will that his talents rust. This, together with the categorical imperative, implies that it would be wrong to perform the act. Here there is no logical contradiction, because this is not a state of P, case of P and not P. I can think of such a situation where I am not developing my natural talents and no one else is developing his natural talents. There is no contradiction in this conjunction. But then what sort of contradiction arises here? The contradiction is, I cannot rationally will such a state because we require each other. We have to develop some of our talents, and we also require that others develop some of their talents. Otherwise we cannot live. We are not independent beings. We depend upon each other. We have to depend upon each other. We are not self-sufficient. So I cannot consistently will. Now Kant's fourth example. In Kant's fourth illustration of the categorical imperative, the categorical imperative is applied to an imperfect duty to others. The duty to help others who are in distress. Kant describes a man who is flourishing and contemplates performing an act of giving to charity. His maxim is not stated by Kant in the text, but it can be probably formulated thus. Maxim: when I am flourishing and others are in distress, I shall give nothing to charity. I am not interfering with them. I am allowing them to go as they like. But I will not help them, although I am in a position to help them. So this is, could it be universalized? Would everyone do the same? Would I desire that everyone will make the same? As in the other example of imperfect duty, Kant acknowledges that this maxim could not be generalized. Yet he claims that the agent cannot consistently will that it be a law of nature. He explains this argument as follows. I will consider. Kant's point is this. The DNA, to quote Kant, for a will which decided in this way would be in conflict with itself. There will be contradiction in willing, volitional contradiction, since many a situation might arise in which the man needed love and sympathy from others, and by such a law of nature he would rob himself of it. To explain, Kant's point is this: the day may come when the agent is no longer flourishing. He may need charity from others. If that day does come, he will find that he wills that others give him such aid. However, in willing that, the generalized maxim, he has already willed that no one should give charity to anybody, any aid to anyone. Hence, in that dark day, on that dark day, his will contradict itself. Thus, he cannot consistently will that the generalized maxim be a law of nature. What was the maxim? I shall not help anybody. So I will that this is my maxim. So let it be generalized. I do not. Everyone. No one should help anybody. Now, what I want is that no one help anybody, but a day may come when I need the help of somebody. So there is a contradiction in willing. I have willed that no one helps anybody. Now I am willing that someone helps me. So this is contradiction in volition. Volitional contradiction. There is no logical contradiction because I can think of that state of affair in which I am not helping, others are not helping, there is no contradiction. But there is contradiction in will. I cannot, as a rational being, I cannot desire, I cannot will such a state of affair. So this is some contradiction in the will, two cases. On the standard Paton interpretations, now Paton here does not give the logical contradiction. He also mentions the practical contradiction. He also mentions a practical contradiction. But the interpretation of practical contradiction given by Paton and that given by Korsgaard are different. I shall read out that part. On the standard Paton interpretations, some maxims were universalized, do not produce logical contradictions, but rather they produce states that no rational agent could want. The classic case is that of benevolence. I will not give anything to charity. This is not universalizable. Because if the agent be rational, he will realize that he would not want to live in a world in which no one gave to charity. Such a world would be depressing indeed. Further, the agent should realize that he himself come to need the benevolence of others, and then would certainly want that some charity be given to him. Again, on Paton's view, there is no logical contradiction, but there is a practical contradiction in that a rational person would not want this to be the case. But Korsgaard interpretation is different. In the first case, what was frustrated? The maxim, the purpose that was stated in the maxim, in the earlier case. But here, what is frustrated is not the purpose that is stated in the maxim. A different something is frustrated. What? Contradiction in the will test gives us another way to get a practical contradiction. When an agent takes an action that generates a contradiction in the will, the purpose that is frustrated by the universalization of the maxim is a purpose that is essential to the will, rather than is a purpose that is essential to the will, rather than the purpose that is actually specified in the maxim itself. What is essential to the will? This is frustrated. But in the case of failure of benevolence, the purpose that is frustrated is not in the maxim itself, but is understood as essential to the will. What is essential to the will? This could be answered in a variety of ways. Exercise of the will requires the capacity for autonomous decision making. It also requires having our basic needs met in order to be autonomous agents. Thus, in the benevolence case, we could not will the failures of benevolence be universalized, since that would be willing a world in which these conditions should not be met. In order to be an autonomous agent, my basic needs have to be fulfilled, and I need the help of others. But I have willed a world in which this possibility is not left open. So this is Kant's explanation of the four types of the examples of the categorical imperative. Now let me state we do not have time, so I shall not consider the objections against Kant. I shall consider the significance of the formula of universal law and the another formula I have mentioned. Let me state it. And then I will consider the significance of these two formulas. I will conclude with that. The second formula, the formula of the humanity formula, always treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of another, not simply or not merely as a means, but always as an end. Now, as I have stated at the very outset, merely is important. Kant is not saying that you cannot treat others as a means. If that is so, then we cannot lead our practical life. I go to the post office, the postman gives me the letter, I have to use it as a means. But what Kant says is that we should not treat him merely as a means for the satisfaction or fulfillment of my end. This is the significance of merely. Now, what does Kant mean by humanity here? This point has to be explained. What does Kant mean by humanity? Kant equates humanity with rational nature, the entire rational nature of a being. Kant is not saying that exactly all and only members of the human species must be treated as ends in themselves. He also says consistently that rational beings are ends in themselves in virtue of their rational nature. Rationality is the key feature that distinguishes typical humans from all the other beings that we know of. So, it is not too great a slip that human beings are ends in themselves. But Kant also thinks that God possesses a rational nature, more perfectly rational than ours. And he even thinks that it could well be that there are races of rational beings living on other planets. So Kant does not mean to say that only members of our biological species can be rational or must be treated as ends in themselves. Rational nature is what makes a being an end in himself. Then being biologically human is not a sufficient condition for being an end in oneself. This point is not taken care of. Generally, it is interpreted as only human beings are being stated by Kant, but no. All rational beings, so far as they are rational beings. This emphasis on rationality. Now, what is the significance of these two principles of Kant? Now, I would like to say that false promising case is a case of lying. Now, regarding lying, Kant's position is very rigid. He will say that lying is always wrong. Under no circumstances should we lie. And here, Professor Bimal Krishna Motilal, in his book Ethics and Ethics, refers to a story in the Mahabharata where the sage Kaushika is mentioned. Some assailants come to him in search of a person, and Kaushika is asked, where is he? And Kaushika tells the truth. And as a result, that person, the murderers killed him. Now, Bimal Krishna Motilal says that this action of Kaushika was not morally right and he could not go to heaven. And in this connection, he also referred to Bankim Chandra, the controversy between Bankim Chandra and Rabindranath. Rabindranath was like Kant, and Bimal Krishna Motilal says that Kant and Rabindranath are my heroes, but I cannot accept their position in this regard. I would like to go for the view stated by or expressed by Bankim Chandra. Bankim Chandra would say that in such a situation one could lie. But Rabindranath says, Mitha, Mithai, Mahamoti, Bankim Chandra, Bolileo Mitha, Swayam Sri Krishna Bolileo Mitha. So he would not relent. It is unconditionally true. There is no scope for any exception. And Kant is also insisting upon it. Rule is a rule. You cannot break the rule. Rule is for the king as well as for the poorest of the poor. There should be no exception. Now let me just conclude saying this part. Kant was intent on protecting the purity of moral law. However tempted we may be to do so, we may not turn the absolute moral law rule against lying into a conditional rule by making exceptions to it, whenever it seems necessary to do so. Exceptions to it whenever it seems necessary to do so. Metaphysics of morals. Kant surely had read Machiavelli. We know that the Frederick the Great had done so, and Kant surely would have remembered that the infamous Machiavelli had recommended that that the prince should not deviate from what is good, if that is possible, but he should know how to do evil, if that be necessary. The prince, understandably, Kant was convinced that once we accept necessity as a valid excuse for any exception to the moral law, and it is of course up to each person to decide what will count as necessary, there is no reason to limit the justification only to a few exceptions. Sooner or later, it will sanction the violation of any and every moral law, and in the end, necessity has no law. So there will be no such thing as morality. Elsewhere, Kant points out that there are many morally acceptable ways in which we may avoid telling the truth without telling a lie. They involve simple silence, mental reservations, non-committal answers, evasions, and equivocations. I am reminded of Swami Gitananda. I read about him, and one of his devotees asked him regarding this question. He said, I shall remain silent. I shall not tell anything, but I shall not tell a lie. This is the suggestion that he gave, and Kant has also mentioned it at some place. Now, what is the significance of this law? First law, all are equal. All are equal. The real point in Kant's formulation seems to be that in morality, we are not to count our own eye differently from the way we count the eyes of other person. All are equal. We are created equal, and we are all equal. And the significance of the second principle, nobility oblige, not the nobility of birth, but the nobility of humanity. The point of view at once proud and humble is this point of view at once proud and humble is very well illustrated by a remark Kant made just before his death. He was very old, very ill, very weak, senile, and almost helpless. Yet, when his physician entered his room, he struggled to his feet to greet him and refused to sit down again until the visitor had taken a chair. Quote, the feeling for humanity, unquote, he explained, quote, has not yet left me. Standing up in the presence of one's doctor, not because he is a doctor, but because he is a man, may be a little thing, a small punctilio of manners. But it does not differ from telling him the truth, because he is a man. Between manners and morals, in this view, there is no chasm. Everyone counts as one. This is the point at which Kant's two formulations come together. My duties to others are no different from my duties to myself. My rights are identical with theirs. It is the respect that is important. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Shri Bhattacharya. I think before I proceed on to invite the young scholars, it would be better if we give some time to the speakers who have already placed the thesis before you for discussion. I invite Professor Gopal Babu to take the chair. And we have seen that two papers are there. Professor Gopal Babu, he is very much disturbed by the miseries of life, violence, etc. And he has said, attempts are being made throughout the world for peace. And history tells us that there are two ways of getting peace. One, war for peace, and the preparation of peace for peace. These two things are there. And he has elaborated the position, and he has taken help of Kant, Mahabharata, and Plato in order to build up a theory, his proposal, his own contribution here in this paper, so that we can form a future situation in which peace talk, peace process can be started. He has mentioned that it is philosophy, it is ideology that creates violence. We are not basically violent by nature. Our biological species doesn't make us violent, but it is ideology that makes it violent and makes us a violent one. So some sort of, it may be my interpretation is faulty of what Professor said, as some sort of ideological interpretation of the situation of violence throughout the world. He has placed it and he has offered a solution, his solution. So for Professor Shubhi Bhattacharya's paper, he has quite nicely elaborated the position of categorical imperative, what it is, how it is formed, what are the different types of imperative, how we pass from maxim to principle by avoiding contradiction. Then he has raised the question of logical contradiction, practical contradiction, contradiction of will, and then he has offered some of the significance of those categorical imperatives, especially two with this example. I thank you, both professors, and I open these two papers before the House for discussion. We will take some time to discuss, not say just 10 minutes. We will stay here. I invite audience.
বাংলায় বলা যাবে?
হ্যাঁ স্যার, নিশ্চয়ই।
সুবীরের কাছে প্রশ্ন। গোপাল বাবুরটা শুনতে পারা যায়নি বলে আমার দুঃখ। আমি ভাবছিলাম আমাকে কটা জন্ম জন্মাতে হবে ওই গোপাল বাবুর মতো একটা পেপার লিখবার জন্য। সুবীরের কাছে প্রশ্ন, মানে এই এতে রেশনালিটি বলতে কি বুঝবো সেইটা একটু আমার জানবার ইচ্ছে। যার উপরে কান্ট এত জোর দিচ্ছেন রেশনালিটি, হোয়াট ইজ মেন্ট বাই রেশনালিটি। আর একটা কথা, ইংরেজিতে একটা কথা আছে, এক্সেপশন প্রুভস দি রুল। রুল আমরা ফ্রেম করি কিসের জন্য? যদি ফর দি ওয়েলফেয়ার অফ হিউম্যানিটি বলি, ফর দি গুড অফ ম্যান বলি, তাহলে যেখানে রুল ব্রেক করলেই গুড হবে সেখানে এক্সেপশন তো অ্যালাউ করাই উচিত বলে মনে হয়। সত্যি কথা বললে যদি আরেকজনের মৃত্যু হয় তখন সেই সত্যিটা সত্যি হবে না মিথ্যে বললেই সত্যি হবে? আমার একটা ঘটনা মনে পড়ছে, কিছুদিন আগে আমার এক ছাত্রীর হাজব্যান্ড মারা যায়। তার মেয়ে নেপালে ডাক্তারি পড়ে। তা সে বারবার ফোন করছে, বাবা বেঁচে আছে কি মরে গেছে বল, তো শুধু আমাকে এই কথাটা উত্তর দাও। সে সেখানে কি উত্তর দেবে? বাবা তখন মরে গেছে। সে কি উত্তর দেবে যে তোমার বাবা বেঁচে নেই? এই উত্তর দেওয়াটাই কি সেখানে জাস্টিস হবে বা সেটা সত্য হবে, রুল প্রুফ করা হবে? আর যেখানে আমরা বলছি ল মেকার শুড নট বি ল ব্রেকার্স, তা ল তো সকলে মেক করে না, কতকজনে মিলে ল ব্রেক করে। তারা ল ব্রেক না করতে পারে, অন্যদের ব্রেক করবার অধিকার আছে কিনা?
প্রথম যেটা বাংলাতেই বলছি, প্রথম যেটা রেশনালিটি, এখানে রেশনালিটি বলতে কান বুঝবেন এবিলিটি টু সেট গোলস, লক্ষ্য স্থির করার, কোর্স অফ অ্যাকশন ডিসাইড করা ইন্ডিপেন্ডেন্টলি, সেটা ক্ষমতা। এবং সেইটা যখন করব কোনো ফিলিং বা ইমোশন